Welcome to the show, come on inside. It's a Bearded Biomed where knowledge provides. We're talking HTM with the layback style, so grab a seat, kick back, and stay a while. Diving deep into your biomedical streams with stories to share some of my expertise. Tune in, relax, let the knowledge flow. In the world of Biomed, there's plenty to know. This bearded host has a passion for the quest, bringing you insights, dropping in some guests. In this healthcare world, I'm breaking it down. Gotta let folks know why I wear the crown. Bearded Biomed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to an all-new episode of the Bearded Biomed. I appreciate you joining me here today. Coming at you with a really interesting interview. Haven't done one in a little while. As you know, I kind of traversed the show to a different angle, but as I promised, there will be insightful interviews and sit down with folks that have meaningful cause to what we need to discuss. And this is a cause that a lot of us can at least point to one time in our career, if not almost on a daily basis, and that's right to repair. The gentleman I have with me today is from PIRG, Nathan. Appreciate you joining me today. And we're just going to get into some very interesting information that, just recently that you wrote up and that we've want to drive the conversation towards. So if you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit of your background.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. My name is Nathan Proctor. I am the Senior Director of the Right to Repair campaign for PIRG or PIRG. And that means that I believe people should be able to fix their stuff. And I've spent the last, 8 years, basically full time working on addressing the ways in which manufacturers of everything from toasters to tractors, and yes, medical equipment, very much so, restrict the ability to repair that equipment in order to, force you to go back to the manufacturer hat in hand, asking for permission for the service keys or for the special software or for this, the proprietary spare parts so that the manufacturer can control that process. And it's, it's bad news top to bottom. So I've been working on this for 8 years, and I'm really passionate about the topic. And, certainly I'm really passionate about the topic in the medical environment because I feel like it's harmful to people when the people who are actually in charge of giving them medical care can't fix their equipment.
So the reason that prompted bringing you onto the show today is because you had a write-up that you recently did on this exact topic point in regards to the armed forces. I'm an Army Biomed veteran myself, so this hits home, especially some of the folks that are in this story I know personally, and it's relatable. I think a lot of people can relate to it. And it's disconcerting a little bit, just, some of their experiences that were written up. And, I'd love for you to share the story. Of course, anybody that wants to read about it, I will have in the description of the episode as well.
Yeah, I'm sure, as you know, that you could write a lot of different stories about this exact same topic. And in fact, I think it's important to get these stories out there. So like, one of the things that if you sign the letter that's included there, I'd love to talk, and you want to have your story told, I'd love to hear more stories. But let me tell you Wesley Reid's story, who was, trained as a biomed and, kind of went into the service after high school, was trained, went to school for this, was deployed into Afghanistan, was working at a hospital, was in charge of one of 2 CT scan piece of equipment in Afghanistan. As your audience knows, like CTs are like a critical emergency, diagnostic tool. People are coming in with possible internal bleeding, possible shrapnel, and whether or not they live could be determined by the CT scan. Like if you don't have that accurate information, that diagnosis doesn't come in soon, there's really high consequences for the patient.
Yeah. With those high trauma, what you're alluding to is that golden hour.
Yes,
what we like
exactly.
To deem it.
Yes. Yeah, and that's what Master Sergeant Reid was telling me about that. And so he had a piece of equipment we've withheld the name of the manufacturer from the publication, but I bet your audience can guess who it is. Apparently, there's these microcontrollers which are allow for basically this kind of troubleshooting process where if one of the scan uh, elements is not working properly, you can skip over it, and you can kind of reprogram it a little bit so that you can still get an accurate scan, even when there's something a little bit off. And you know, this tool like expires, like it works for a little bit and then it stops working, and so it stopped working. And he asked the manufacturer for a new microcontroller so that he could continue to use the equipment, and they wouldn't give it to him. So they said, nah, we think that this equipment's too old. We don't want you to use it anymore. And he's like, he was in, like there wasn't an option. There wasn't like a new CT scan, like he didn't go to the Cobble, CT scan depot and just buy it was incredibly difficult to get it out there. And yeah, he just had to work around these restrictions. And he was telling me that his mental health, it was extremely stressful because it was life or death situations every day. He didn't have the proper repair materials, so he had to kind of do a workaround. It was like, and Marines' lives, in other service members' lives were on the line, and just the idea that he wouldn't have the right materials to do the repair because the manufacturer's executives felt like it was just preferable to their stockholders to do it that way. I think it really convinced him of the need for the military to have a full right to repair. And the reason why I'm telling this story is because Senator Elizabeth Warren put in an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual funding of the armed services, that says, okay, when the military buys equipment, they should also get all the parts, tools, and information necessary to keep that equipment going forever. And they should have access to those things. So they should negotiate that on the front end. So there's no, like, oh, well, you need to fix it now. Well, now we are going to upcharge you for all these things. And we're not saying that these companies have to let you have access to all these materials for free. They just need to include it in the upfront purchase contract for when the military picks up the equipment. So they're not in a situation where they're negotiating with the manufacturer over access to these microcontrollers in the middle of a war zone. And like, that's horrible. So yeah, so that to me was a really good example of why that kind of right to repair for the military is really important, right? Because we know these manufacturers like being able to lower the upfront cost in order to jack up the service cost later, because there's no competition for that. Once it's out there, they can basically charge whatever they want. They can make you pay $100,000 for something that cost them $5,000. This is, any company who likes money and doesn't care about harming others, would be attracted to this kind of service environment. But it's just not compatible with the service operations that we're doing in the military, and frankly, a hospital's regular operations it's not compatible with. So that's the point of telling this story, is because I think it's a strong case that we should set these rules for the military. That when they are looking to get equipment for use in their operations, they need to have the right to fix that equipment, and all the materials that make that possible and that are best, basically the best tools available, they should have those.
And there's so much to unwrap with that. So for context is we understand there are two sides of the aisle with the discussion. I read a lot of write-ups, a lot of communications on both sides. And one of the main ones that the manufacturer will point to is, are these individuals that are doing these repairs trained? Well, first off, Master Sergeant Reid, he was trained by the manufacturer to service this piece of equipment. Secondly, is there has been numerous studies done within the field that equipment lifecycle management, the age and life expectancy of the equipment, far exceeds the date stamp placed on by manufacturers. And I feel comfortable in saying that's holistically across the board in every sector, tractors, etc. And the problem that we get into, especially when we have the conversation with it being in theater in Afghanistan, is it's one thing to argue that you have to go and purchase a new one on the civilian sector because it's end of life, they're not supported no longer. This is in a wartime area where there are literally only two within the entire country. Not to mention, if they had to go the route and purchase another one, do you know the hurdles and the stop gaps along the way? If let's say the CT went down today and there was no workarounds after everything Reed could do, there's no other option. So they go through the process of purchasing it. Well, anybody that is familiar with handling purchasing within the US military, it is not a quick and easy process. Not to mention, you're adding in the aspect of shipping all this without damage, the setup, and the training on the new modality because it's going to have to come with training as well. So you were effectively shutting down operation to be able to assess critical injuries that could save the life of our service members. And that's the disconcerting part. It whether what side of the discussion you might be on, this shouldn't be under discussion. These are people that have signed their lives away to go support our country. And at the very least, we should be able to make sure they have the bare necessities to care for them if and when something does occur that their life is on the line. That was
Yeah.
something that was like, I need to bring Nathan on to discuss this because I want not
Yeah.
only my biomeds to know about this, but the general public needs to be aware of this as well.
Master Sergeant Reed said something to me that I thought was, he said when people sign up for the military, like they make a promise to America to, follow orders and put themselves in danger, and in turn there are promises made to them, right? That they're not starving, like they have a place to stay, like, and the medical care that they receive. That's a big part of the promise we make to our soldiers, to our war fighters, and to not be able to uphold that promise because a manufacturer, doesn't feel like or is reluctant to, share certain pieces of material because they have their own commercial interests is, it's unacceptable, right? It's like the promise that we're making to these soldiers should basically trump that, whatever those interests are. And so I that made total sense to me. And frankly, I think a lot in our society should take precedence over, private gain. Like, I think we have way too much of those interests across the board in our society, and it's hollowing out kind of our humanity a little bit. But I think this is an example where we could all agree, like, this is wrong. We should
Yeah.
just make sure that the people who are fixing medical equipment that's meant to serve people fighting in wars have the service materials that are designed for that
And
purpose.
the medical manufacturers that are supplying the US military as a whole with medical devices, a lot of these devices are actually tailored specifically for military use as well, that the civilian sector would never see. So if these manufacturers are comfortable selling, supporting, allowing these particular devices to go into theater, to go in Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever it may be, then they should have a plan set up to allot the support of this device as opposed to just saying it's end of life. There's nothing we can do for you. We hope nobody dies. And
You know,
unfortunately, that's how it came across to me.
yeah, and it's it's not just medical equipment that they're dealing with this in the military, which is, I mean, I one of the reasons why I wrote this piece was because you're not the only biomed that I know that got trained in service, right? There's
Yeah.
a lot in the field. It's one of the reasons. I mean, frankly, I think it's one of the reasons why the field is has so much professionalism and dedication is because I feel like that a lot of those values are kind of built into the way that biomeds operate all over the country, even people who weren't in the service, like they're working with other people who were. So I think that kind of rubs off. But it's generators. Yeah, it
Military
is tanks
vehicles.
and jets. I mean,
Yeah.
but there was a story in the New York Times about like these people who are kind of near the demilitarized zone in Korea, and they had mud and all these other things. They need a diesel generator, but the the logistics officers who were in charge of this equipment weren't permitted under contract to service it. And I mean, for anybody who knows and works with diesel engines, the idea that just a technician who's working with the diesel engine in a Humvee and a diesel engine in that they wouldn't be able to fix the generator is preposterous and absurd. Like, it's just because these manufacturers, they've just made a commercial decision to handle the repairs this way because it's beneficial to them, and it's I understand why they do it. I think it's wrong. It causes harm, and they should try to make money by selling better equipment and not by kind of building these gotcha situations into the equipment so that when you run into something, they got to pay you through the nose to get it fixed.
The progression of life expectancy in all devices across America, and the proprietary aspect of date stamping, software integration, specific keys, passcodes, things that are built into the device, the machinery to make it obsolete within a certain time period. Not because it's faulty, but just because it's time to buy something else. That's something that isn't necessary. It's for profit. There are hospitals in rural America that I've been in that have devices 30, 40 years old that are still fully operational and actually somewhat more reliable than some of the newer technologies. Not saying that's the case across the board, but especially in the military, in my experience over the years and deployments I went on, we didn't have the latest and greatest all the time, but we had the expertise and the wherewithal to service this equipment. And I feel like there's a discussion that needs to be had from the manufacturer entities and, of course, folks that are advocating for the right to repair movement to coalesce and see if there's some kind of middle ground. Because right now, sometimes it comes across as I don't know if there really is. I'm just curious what your idea on that landscape might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of like what the middle ground is companies need to provide fair and reasonable to me, that's the middle ground. Fair and reasonable access to all the service materials. If manufacturers need to charge a little bit more up front for the equipment in order to like factor in the investments that they make, etc., so that that they're making their profit margins, then they should do that. But I think that the thing that is happening is by withholding the parts, tools, and information you need to service the equipment, and for medical equipment, this is like a lot about service keys and these software tools increasingly. Obviously spare parts is something that is a big issue, but especially for these, as things get more computer chips, like and they're embedded firmware and all these other things, like there's really hard to find. There's no generic spare parts for anything anymore. It feels there's a lot less of that than there used to be. But like service keys is the thing I hear about the most, right?
Yes.
And this is true. This is increasingly true for all pieces of equipment, right? People are changing headlights in their car and needing to do a firmware patch so that the car headlights work.
Yeah.
And if Toyota or whoever doesn't have to share that with you, or they can charge you whatever they want, I mean, that's not a good situation for the consumer. That's not fair. If companies want to make money, they should do it by selling better products, and they should do it up front. I have no problem with companies making money selling great stuff. It's just not fair to be kind of like stuck with equipment, and the only person who can fix it is now charging you kind of outrageous quantities of money. I mean, the stories that people tell me about John Deere equipment, for example, like, oh, I changed the the turn signal in my tractor, and the dealer came. It wouldn't operate. The whole tractor went down because a critical safety system, and there was an electronic controller in that turn signal, and I needed a VIN burned proprietary firmware patch to get
Yeah.
the turn signal to work again. The dealer charged me $1,400 for that. That's insane. I mean, that is insane. That should not happen. I
Well,
think there's just way too much of that stuff in our society right
let's
now where people
speak
are taking
to
advantage of
because
us.
not every American out there has a John Deere tractor. Not every American out there has to work on or service medical equipment. However, medical equipment is always going to take care of you, your loved one, your family members, etc.
Fair.
Something as simple as a printer. If you do not put in that manufacturer print head, it will throw an error code. Everybody uses printers, cars, like you were saying. Having any kind of issue, you have to take it to the specific dealer if it's anything electrical. There's things within our society that what is the actual definition of ownership of after you purchase something? And I understand there is the legality promise of, who's liable if something were to happen, etc. But as an owner, as you purchasing that, aren't you taking on that liability and those risks associated with it anyway? I'm just curious, like, what's some of the buzz when it comes to these discussions, out there on Capitol Hill and, the discussions you've had?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, taking a step back, electronic waste is the fastest growing waste stream in the world. It is by far the largest source of like especially toxic materials. It's because you have mercury, you have lead, you've got the flame retardants they spray on electronic components. The piece, are like very, very dangerous to human health. These things are getting in our air and water. Like that's just so electronic waste is a big problem. And electronic manufacturing is incredibly energy and resource intensive, right? They're talking about sending robots 2 miles under the surface of the sea to like scoop up environments where no human being has ever been. It's literally more remote than the surface of the moon. You have, these sea creatures that live hundreds or thousands of years that we know almost nothing about. We're going to send robots down there to scoop up these materials, and then these companies are going to build them into disposable electronics. Something has gone kind of off the rails with the way that we have planned obsolescence up and down in our society, and it makes no sense, you know, from the long term perspective. It makes sense if you're a company, you just want to sell a lot of things, but we need to do something about this, right? And so there's an element of what is ownership and like what's a proper system, and we need to put these rules back in place. If I was to see, like, if I was to trace what's changed in the last generation, that this problem has gotten a little bit wacky, it really is like we used to have these rules about patents and these different intellectual property protections for people who made stuff. And the deal with a patent is you tell somebody exactly, especially for a use patent, you tell somebody exactly how something is works, and then you're like, okay, now nobody can make something that works exactly like this because I've patented this
Yeah.
technology. And but there was no restrictions on fixing it, right? In fact, the documentation, it was like public. You could like literally go to the copyright office and look up any of these things. But then as things transition to software, they're governed by copyright, which has a different set of rules. And then we passed new copyright rules to stop like Napster. And those rules now are being weaponized by medical device manufacturers and John Deere and other device manufacturers to make it a crime to literally fix something that you own. And that's, we need to fix that problem, right? Because when it becomes like we've transitioned the legal environment that protected ownership and modifying and fixing and these things that were part of ownership. Now manufacturers have really crossed, you know, extended their intellectual property rights over our physical property in ways that are very new. And the fruits of that environment are like repair is becoming very difficult and complex, and there's a lot of price gouging happening through the process. Planned obsolescence is totally out of control. Electronic waste is totally out of control. So I think it's important to clarify what the limits of that of the manufacturer's rights and what our rights are. And to me, that's an important part of this struggle. I would say, if you talk about on Capitol Hill, like, manufacturers have weaponized the idea of intellectual property in a place like Congress to the point of absurdity, where somehow it's the manufacturer's thought property, so I can't fix my John Deere tractor. Like, that's crazy, right? Like, but that's literally, there are people who think that, oh, you can't let people touch that. That's John Deere's property. So I think we need to have that fight, because I don't think there's a middle ground when you have that as one side being like, oh, but it's my thought property how your tractor works. It's like, no, 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 no. I paid $500,000 for this piece of equipment. If I want to go in there and change the turn signal,
Yeah.
that's my track. Like, we can't be in, like, we're not doing this. This is, we need to fix this problem. Repair is the right of the owner. And I think we just need to hold firm, frankly. And to the extent that there's a middle ground, I don't think it's about that. I think it's more about, okay, training. What's access to training? What are reasonable training costs? What are how do we make sure that there's not escalating costs down the line? And how do we make sure that the people who are actually doing the repairs, like, have some level of, there's some standards that are universal? Like, that's a conversation that I think most biomeds would welcome, right? I think that everyone's aware that, like, this is a field where expertise you bring to it is really important. So I think that both sides could kind of come to some agreement on what those are. But in the meantime, letting manufacturers basically enforce quality, in a
Yeah.
way that also benefits them tremendously commercially, like, that's really not a good situation.
There's not that there's no oversight on it, but there's not, to me it sounds like that like you said, the intellectual property conversation needs to be looked at on what exactly that should entail, because it's overbearing into the general public of what they own and what their rights are to do with what they purchase. I think biomeds are wholly open to the discussion of anything that makes our job easier. The the day-to-day aspect of us having to have backdoor channels, communicate with each other offline on how to, make certain things happen, and sharing resources has always been something that we are very prevalent and good at nowadays. Which is kind of funny, you know, when I first started in the career field, we didn't have these avenues of communication. It was very much so, you got what you got from the manufacturer, and hopefully somebody around your general area knew what to do about it. Now we have social media, we have the internet, we have tools at our disposal that allow us to hopefully do our job, which there will always be stopgaps currently right now, as you alluded to in the story you wrote up. And, it's at the end of the day, as you alluded to as well, biomeds were professionals. I would say probably 60 to 70% of the field was military trained, and the military trained biomeds are some of the best trained technicians out there in the United States today. Not to mention, a lot of those graduates go on to work for the manufacturers. So they're pulling those same technicians from the people they're also preventing to work on what they've been trained on to do as well. So there's
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a story from somebody who was telling me that, like, Monday through Wednesday they were certified by the OEM as, like, they worked for the OEM, and then Thursday, Friday they worked for the local hospital. So they were qualified to fix the piece of equipment on Monday through Wednesday, but they weren't qualified on Thursday and Friday. And I mean, that's just an example. Like,
yeah,
the whole qualifications thing is, it just means contractually controlled. It doesn't mean that they know how to fix the equipment. And we have to, like, I can't accept that premise that the manufacturer's authorized system is to make sure that there's quality, because it's like, if that was true, then you would have a system that actually was based on qualifications, but you don't. And I've been told about OEM technicians that come in that all they got in training was a series of YouTube videos and a 1-800 number. And then they show up to fix medical.
Well, and it's not the case all the time, because there are good technicians out there, but
For both
we
manufacturers
yeah,
and independents. Yeah,
absolutely.
and for HDO.
But there is a notion from a manufactured technician coming in, and I'm sure a lot of people could have some semblance of the story, but they come in with what we designate as a hero kit. There's not really a level of understanding and troubleshooting that occurs 100% of the time from the manufacturer. There are some technicians out there that are third party ISO companies that are in house, that are, private biomeds, that are far greater technicians than what the manufacturers are making available to service those equipment. So it's just, that's the
Yeah, no,
part.
I believe the way I view it is like I believe that the person who's best qualified to decide is the hospital, is the
Yeah,
person actually delivering the medical care. Like,
because they're going to decide who services it anyway.
yeah, they're going to decide, and they're going to decide based on the most important thing at the end of the day. And I trust them to make that decision because that's their motivation, right? And I've talked to hospitals who, like, they did the math. They're like, oh, okay, when there was one company that made endoscopes, and they had kind of gone through a period of rapid growth. They bought some other companies, and their technicians were kind of scrabbling to get enough, right? Because they had really kind of done some growth, so they came to the hospital, and they're like, hey, we have, we noticed you aren't hiring our authorized technicians. And the hospital is like, oh, we did the math. 21% of the time that your technicians come in, the equipment, it fails. It doesn't work. Like, their return rate is like 3 times the rate of the local ISO, which we've been working with. And you're, $800 an hour, and they're 250. Do you want us to pay more for worse quality service? Because that's what you're asking me right now. As a starting point, why don't you come down your hourly rate to 250, and then maybe we can have a conversation. But like, it's like sometimes the manufacturers are just so much better, like their servicers are just better than whatever else is available, so you hire them. And that seems good. That seems like, if you wanted an environment where, like, hospitals are hiring people who are the best, sometimes those people cost more. But there's situations where the manufacturers are not, like, because they've had maybe some turnover, maybe they bought a line of equipment from another manufacturer, and they're still scaling up their servicing of it. Or, maybe they're not good in your regional area, they just don't have a lot of coverage in the part of the country that you are. Like, why should we force the hospital because of your contractual, limitations, and because of your ability to restrict access to parts, tools, information, and training? Why would we restrict them from hiring better servicers at lower price? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. And that doesn't make sense to American healthcare, which, really the cost really needs to come down if we're gonna, like it's kind of crazy how much more it costs in this country to get healthcare than other countries which actually have better outcomes. So, like, this is just one of those things that I call stupid healthcare costs. It's like,
Yeah.
we need to stop having really stupid healthcare costs. Like, we shouldn't just be paying more for worse outcomes. We need to, if we want the whole system to work, we need to purge some of these bad systems, and let the cream rise to the top. And to me, yeah, let the hospital decide. And manufacturers are going to get a lot of those contracts. Like, obviously they have a huge advantage in marketing their services because they know the equipment, because they come in with the purchase agreements. And
Yeah.
but there's places where the hospital is going to look at it and say, listen, we did the analysis, and your people aren't as good as these other people. Like, we hired a bunch of Army vets for our in-house biomed team, and they're just better than your people. And so we're going to go with them. And the manufacturer shouldn't be able to stop that just because they want to, right? They
Well,
should, if
I
they're going
like
to work,
that.
if they want that business, they should win it back by being better.
Yeah. And you alluded to with the area of coverage. So, depending on the manufacturer, what state you might be in, I know of particular areas and particular manufacturers that might only have one technician to cover an entire state or a couple technicians. because usually they're trained on a particular modality or a set of the same kind of modality, and then they're dispatched to cover a region. Again, it'll differ depending on the manufacturer, but what I'm alluding to is if the manufacturer doesn't necessarily have the area of support with where that hospital might be, guess who they're calling? They're calling the independent service provider to work on behalf of the manufacturer.
Right. Right.
It's happened more than you might think. And I find that funny that that is never brought up in discussion by the OEM, because that would change the conversation as well. It's very commonplace. My company has ran numerous manufacturer sponsored service calls because they had no one to go out to rural America. And guess what? Most of America is rural America. So there's a conversation as well in that, and I just appreciate you bringing that up because it's something that drives me insane.
Yeah, no, it's obviously something I've heard before. Like, I mean, there's some environments where, like, the manufacturers that's a hub office for them and they have great coverage. But there's a lot of people who are like, oh, I got to fly in someone from Chicago, and I have to pay for their travel time at like whatever, like a minimum of $8,000 to get this person just to walk through the door. For a small hospital that's struggling to make ends meet, like, we need to stop doing this kind of thing.
In that story you wrote up as well, there was a secondary story. I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that before we get you out of here today, because I thought that was quite interesting.
Is it the one with the diagnostic? Yeah, and this was lab equipment, so this wasn't. I mean, this but in the military, I guess the biomeds often service equipment that maybe wouldn't be thought of as medical equipment in the kind of civilian space, but all of this industrial
Yeah,
kind of lab
chemistry
equipment.
analyzers, that measures blood, urinals. There's a slew of lab equipment that biomeds work on a day-to-day basis as well. But again, lab equipment in general is very heavily proprietary. I would argue, if not more than radio, imaging equipment. Some of it is just you can't even get service manuals for it. They won't sell parts at all. So that's why I wanted to touch on this story, because I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, so there was a chemistry analyzer on Kwajalein, and folks might know where that is, but it's like 2,500 miles west of Hawaii. There's a U.S. military installation there, very important radar installation, important for global GPS, but also for monitoring the Pacific. It's like a critical base. And the piece of equipment broke. And, this is also, again, a story from Wesley Reid. He called the manufacturer and they said, okay, well, the service district is like from the Philippines. And he said, well, they can't come here like unless they're American citizens, because only Americans can come to, like, this is a U.S. military installation. And in some cases, you need some kind of security clearance, depending on where it is on the facility. And so you have to send but you have to send an American. They didn't have any Americans that were working in the Philippines for their operations, and they didn't want to send anybody from the continental U.S. So he's like, okay, so you won't come out here. You have nobody that can actually be here. So can I get the materials, the information, parts, tools? I basically need the service manual. And they said no. They, like you were saying, totally proprietary. There's no way we can let you have that. So it's like, so you won't let me service it, and you won't service it, but it's here. So, like, why did you sell it to us if you knew that we could never get it serviced? And so he had to basically reverse engineer, the us,
Schematics and
like the service manual. He had to figure, he had to, like, he spent hours and hours and hours trying to figure out how this thing worked, and eventually he was able to fix it. But it's like every moment that he spent, right, it was that he wasn't doing something else, just to recreate the information that the manufacturer could have handed him, but they chose not to. And, like, it's just another reminder, like, that should be part of this. Like, if you want to sell things to the military, and it's going to be in environments where you can't send a technician, because that's a lot of environments that the U.S. military is going to be working with, there needs to be a way for the U.S. to maintain that equipment. So that should be included in the purchase contract. And if you refuse, then they can buy the equipment from
they
somebody
shouldn't be
else.
selling equipment to U.S. Armed Forces to
Well, yeah,
begin with.
you don't have to sell to the U.S. Army
Yeah,
or or any of these military branches. Like, you could sell to somebody else. You can make that choice. But if you're going to sell it to them, they got to be able to service it. Like, that is unfair to the American people to ask us to pay somebody to reverse engineer our service manual. Like, just because the manufacturer decided they're not going to make that available.
Nathan, a slew of information today. I appreciate you writing this up because it hits home for me. I'm sure it hits home for a lot of people. It's a discussion that continues, that needs to be had, and I think educating the general public as well of what this actually looks like, as opposed to just hearing, a news segment real quick about, cell phones or John Deere. Like this touches a lot more different sectors, especially where we're at with medical devices. Before I let you go today, is there anything that you would encourage people to check out, or, of course, any links you send me, I'll have in the description below as well. We
Yeah,
have that form that you had mentioned as well.
right. If you served, our country, in the armed services, and you want to add your name to this letter calling for the military to get the right to repair its equipment, that the link to that letter will be there. And, there's a place to indicate if you're willing to talk to me. I want to publish more of these stories because, from what I'm hearing up on Capitol Hill, like, the stories are kind of turning some heads that maybe were kind of writing us off before. Like, oh, that seems bad. Like, we can't do that. Like, I think people understand the value and importance of keeping our promise to take care of our service members. And I think these stories are going to help us, especially if you actually serviced equipment that wasn't medical equipment. I'd like to get some stories up about generators and other kinds of equipment that are being used, like to broaden the focus, because I think that, like, we need the right to fix all that equipment. And the medical equipment is I just happen to know more biomeds than some of these other technicians, but I'd love to get more stories.
It's a good group to know, though, ain't it?
It's the best, man. I have to say, yeah, it's been a treat to get to know more of the medical servicing community. I think of biomeds as kind of like these ninjas that work in hospitals, and they magically come up in, like, fix things when everyone else is not paying attention, and it's like they make everything run, and they're so, like, they're part of the background, but they're such a critical part. It's really cool to think about just how critical repair technicians are to society, but then especially in this medical environment where, like, it's life or death, and then these people are bailing out the system all the time. Yeah, you guys are heroes. So just a salute to the biomeds out there.
Appreciate all of our armed forces that are continuing doing the duty, and hopefully someday we can see real enacted change that makes this make sense. So, Nathan, I appreciate you being on with us today. It's been a pleasure, sir. I learned something, and I'm sure other people did as well. And be sure to check out the description below. If you enjoyed the episode, like, subscribe, share. Fill out that form if you're one of our armed services folks. And as always, may the beard be with you. Appreciate you joining us today.
Bearded.
Yes, the beard is with me.
Biomed.